this button down here, you can't hardly see it in the dark here.
Yeah.
It's got a little power symbol on it.
Yeah.
You just kind of have to press and hold it. And then once you see everything light up, let it go. And now it's good to go.
Cool.
And then anytime you can just turn it off. Or I can just mute it.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Okay.
I'll turn it on and mute it. You have microphone number 7, so I'll just pop that down.
Great. Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, is that because you're I know, and I still have them just a little window. Yeah. We'll see you.
Hey, you're all clean. Yeah, look at that, it's gone. Wow. What happened?
Hey, how you doing?
Oh, for change.
It's a huge change.
You don't look so evil.
That was Dick Dastardly.
Yeah, dastardly, exactly. I'm a little bit less scared.
You look like 20 years younger.
Okay.
Are you going to stop the hallway?
Yeah.
Maybe. I'm still going to talk to you have one yelling at
You wearing the girl's name Penelope.
I know. Run with the water, hopefully. I'm like, Lynn, I said so whatever. So we're giving a couple minutes. Sorry, I wasn't signaling. I was looking at the clock because I told Lynn, oh, there's a clock, but the clock currently says it's like 4:45. So, which is awesome, but wrong. We're just waiting, Jay, to get Lynn a water. We'll just give people a couple minutes. So.
And that should be anything else.
Oh yes, that has. You know. Excellent. Good afternoon. Welcome once again to Campus Conversations, formerly known as Moving Dartmouth Forward. It's a pleasure to have you all with us. I know there are many familiar faces in the audience, so as you know, this is an event sponsored by the President's Office. This is our last one for this academic year. Certainly, if you have ideas or topics that we might cover during the next academic year, please feel free to forward them to me or to the President's Office. We'd love to hear your suggestions. For today, it's my pleasure to kick off a conversation about our global learning experiences. We have Lynn Higgins, Associate Dean of the Faculty for International and Interdisciplinary Studies with us today. Lindsay Whaley from the Provost Office may be joining us later. So we'll welcome him if he has the opportunity to join us. But for now, I'd like to turn it over to Lynn and just remind everyone that we are being videotaped and actually live streaming today's session. And when we come to our discussion portion, we do have a microphone to be passed around, so we'd encourage you to use that so everyone can hear you both here and at their desks. Lynn.
Thanks, Naraya. Can you hear me? Can you hear me better that way? Yes. Oh, good. Okay. Just a few preliminary remarks, and then I'm going to show you some slides, and then we're going to have a conversation. The topic, as I take it, is about our activities, international activities for students. And although we have many faculty and other folks who engage in international activities, my focus is on students, but I'm happy to broaden that if you have questions or ideas. So the sky's the limit in terms of the topic. But about student activities, I just wanted to say that within the broader topic, I want to focus my own attention on how we define these activities, how we can provide the best possible activities in terms of academic excellence, in terms of safety, and in terms of ethical responsibility. So those are some of the areas that interest me. Let me say a few words about myself and a few words about Lindsay. I can say anything I want because she's not here. Oh, we're live streaming. Well, never mind. I'm glad Naraya said the name of my title because it's very long and it's easy to stumble over. The international studies part is the part that's relevant today. But I'm also a professor of French. I want you to know that. And my credentials in international things comes from having grown up outside the United States in large part, having studied a lot of languages, having been at the age of 3 the daughter of house parents in an international studies dorm where I was kind of the mascot. But that's anecdotal compared to the fact that since I've been at Dartmouth, I teach courses on international topics, and I've also directed about 15 of Dartmouth's off-campus study programs, term-long programs. So that's my emphasis, and if I stray too far toward talking about those, you can bring it back and ask about or talk about other things. Lindsay Whaley is Associate Provost for International Initiatives, but he's also a professor of classics and linguistics. I'd like to all, I can't see everybody clearly, but you probably all know each other anyway, but I want to also to introduce 2 other people who are very essential to our international activities. John Tansey, can you raise your hand or stand up, who is Executive Director of the Off-Campus Programs Office, and Lynn Whitecloud, who is Assistant Director of the Off-Campus Programs Office. All right. I don't do lecture classes that much. You can't get people to speak a foreign language unless they speak it, so I do discussions, and this is called a conversation, but I do want to introduce it with a couple of slides, just a couple of images. A couple weeks ago, I gave a presentation for dimensions for the incoming students and the accepted students, and I got permission to use some of the slides, and I modified them a little bit, just to give you a sense of what our activities are for undergraduates, even those who are here all the time are sometimes surprised to find out the breadth of the kinds of activities we offer. So the Dimensions folks provided this lovely little flow chart where we have a schematic of our curricular and co-curricular activities. And the curricular ones are divided down to on-campus and off-campus. The co-curricular ones are also divided down in the same way. And as you can see, we have classes, we have international studies minor, we have all kinds of community-based activities, and we have language classes, which are very much a part of our international profile. And off-campus, we have language study abroad, we have foreign study programs, we have exchange programs, we have transfer terms, and, well, there's probably more. Co-curricular activities on campus, we have an upcoming residential living experiment called Global Village. We have research projects, clubs, organizations, lectures, visiting, performances of all kinds. Hanover becomes quite an international place when we start taking the hood and the hop and the speakers into account. And off-campus, of course, internships, research projects, and so on. I'm going to just give you a very brief look at the individual slides for all of those, just to give you a bigger sense of the breadth of the kind of activities we have. Okay, and the main slide is a couple of questions I've put together with some input from lots of people, questions that we might use to focus our conversation, to think about the broader picture and also the details. And here are some questions. We can also expand those questions to provide sub-questions, expansions, and all kinds of details. So rather than continue myself, I'm going to take some notes while you talk to me, and I'm happy to answer questions or to tell you that I don't know the answer, but I'll find out. And I am especially eager to hear your ideas or how you think of the questions involved, or what other questions you have on your radar screen that maybe aren't on mine. So jump right in. Yes, Anthony.
Oh. What is the current trend that we're seeing in terms of students participating in off-campus, or more precisely, actually, international study abroad programs and the LSAs?
Current trends. I'm a humanist. So let's see if I can come up with any numbers. We have plus or minus 600 students who participate in oh, John, you have this information, don't you? At the tip of your fingertip? Yeah, I'm doing okay? It's plus or minus 600 students who participate in our organized off-campus study programs. And then a very large number of students who do other things. And in fact, that's one of the areas that I'd like to hear your ideas about, because we have students who participate in all those things that were on the list, research projects, internships, trips, service activities, and so on. Keeping track of them is not easy, so I don't have numbers about that necessarily, although there may be numbers in pockets around campus. But also defining what we mean by an international experience. Can you have an international experience on campus? I think you can, but that's why one of the questions, what role might international students play in internationalizing the on-campus experience, might come in. Am I answering your question?
Yes, to start. I have a second part to follow up in a minute.
Go ahead.
So the reason I ask about the trend is I know a couple of years ago when I was much more involved in this question as well, you know, one of the lingering questions or challenges, and I think it plays in well with the whole idea of, you know, Dartmouth, leading Dartmouth forward, is that a number of students had begun to express more and more the concern that they'd go abroad, they'd have this wonderful language experience, but they were a government major or an economics major, or, you know, they weren't necessarily interested in majoring in a foreign language or even a minoring necessarily in a foreign language, and yet they didn't want to, they wanted opportunities to continue to use that, the language and the experience that they've had, but in a way that was more applicable to perhaps their major topic. And I guess one of the questions then I have is, you know, does this continue to be a question that people are discussing in terms of how might we offer courses that allow students to bring that experience back and to continue studying, for example, you know, business classes in German or, you know, things like that, and whether or not this is something that Dartmouth is looking at?
Wow, that's a lot of questions, and they're all terrific questions. Yes is the answer. Yes, we would like to have that. You show me business faculty who can teach courses in German, and I'll be all on board. One of the questions let me try to separate out the questions you're asking. One of them is, how do we follow up on off-campus experiences? And that's something I would really love your input on. We're working on that, but by nature of the D plan and some of the programs themselves, it's very difficult to have the ramp up and then the reintegration after return. So ideas that you have on either of those subjects, all of you, would be very welcome. Another question you're asking is, what's the relationship between language programs and non-language programs, in a way? I mean, we started this venture many years ago in language study. I believe the first group was in 1958 that got credit for studying abroad, and it was in Spanish. So that's where we got started. And the language departments tended to have the LSAs and the FSPs, the advanced programs. And then maybe a little more than a decade ago, we added the LSA plus, that intermediate level, for students who wanted to study the language but didn't want to take the prerequisites for the advanced program. But now we have a large number of programs that aren't language programs. And so one of the questions that interests me in what you said is, what could be the mission? What is the mission? What could be the opportunities in our programs that are not primarily language and culture programs, but that are in a place that has language and culture? And although that isn't the focus of the program in many instances, it seems to me to be a shame and perhaps even a little unadvisable to have programs that don't pay attention to the local culture and language. And so that's another question. How can we provide intercultural experiences, intercultural communication experiences, even language experiences for students in programs that are not primarily focused on language? That's a second question you're asking. Am I covering the territory? Yeah. Do people have ideas about those things? I would love to hear them. Lynn?
Well, an idea that has been shared extensively on campus here and then at other institutions, but may or may not have the right fit for Dartmouth, I'm not sure, but has potential, is the concept of a portfolio project for graduating seniors, or actually introduction into the first year and followed developmentally throughout. And it's something that, if conceptualized in a developmental way, possibly through that curricular and co-curricular pattern that you showed earlier, it's a way that could be interfaced by students directly. It could be interfaced with faculty, with students, doing some kind of reflection or project that they're recording, and that recording can be digital, it can be video, it can be writing, it could even be listing, as long as what they're doing is sharing an aspect of what they've learned or how they're connecting their learning. So in its most simple form, it's a way to allow students to reflect and connect their learning, and it's a way for Dartmouth to consider what might be a couple overarching questions also that we would want to pose perhaps to all students, but then smaller sets of questions or engagement would be coming out of something as specific as an economics minor or a LSA or an internship, etc.
Yes, that has been on the table. In fact, the Curriculum Review Committee, that is still pursuing its work, has discussed the idea of a portfolio, and I think that people are very positively inclined, except for the logistics of it, which remain a little bit daunting. Advising, it's very, who reads the portfolios, what is the portfolio, and Christiane knows a lot about that. I don't want to put you on the spot, but would you like to say anything about it? You agree? Yeah. So what do you think that a portfolio could be? I definitely agree that a portfolio system for the education overall would help us weave together the international and off-campus experiences with the on-campus experience. But how do you imagine that happening? This is a class, folks. Maybe you have the same level of question mark as the committee did. You know, how would we do that? How would we? Could it be something electronic? Could it be something that is just verbal? Could it be something that's a written document that is accrued over time in different locations and different circumstances? Would it be a culminating presentation of some kind? I really personally don't have an idea about that. Yes?
Is it related to that app that's already in place with Roger Lewis's office? App where you put in information about your experience or notes, like a journal? It could be.
It could be. Talkative bunch. Could be, yeah, it could be. It could be any number of things, and we're still working on it.
So I don't want to dominate this conversation. I know there are other people in the room that have some knowledge about portfolios. I think that there are ways to construct a portfolio that allows for, you know, the simplicity of a few different pathways where some can be optional interactions that students have with the e-portfolio. Others would be constructed pieces that a course could have students engage with. And so those are designed and come out of a particular course. So those are customized. So you could have something that is self-initiated section of a portfolio. You could have something that is customized that comes out of a particular course design. And then you could have a component that might be determined that is a series of developmental tasks over the course of the 4 years that is initiated by the institution, so that then that is something that's a common over all students for, yeah.
Even ideally over the 4 years. Yeah. One of the events we have had for some number of years now that I've been very impressed with is the annual Forum on Global Learning, which is gives an opportunity to students who choose to do it to present their experiences learning outside the campus. I want to bring up, maybe this is a little controversial, but I want to bring up something that I find puzzling, and I think we could put our heads together and think about this a little more clearly than I've been able to do so far, which is we have two different goals, and I'm not sure how they relate. I put what goals does international experience serve? Actually, maybe I'll put off my reflection on that for a minute to ask you what that question might mean to you. What kinds of goals come to mind for you? I mean, we say we want to internationalize our campus, and quite often that's because other campuses are internationalizing their campuses. And it's worthwhile to stop and say, well, why do we want to do that? What are the actual goals that we want to serve by providing international experiences?
Okay.
And again, I don't want to dominate the conversation either, but in the absence of silence, or in order to have an absence of silence, for me it goes back to my own experiences. I mean, my experiences studying and living and working abroad, you know, just changed everything about how I see the world, and in a very positive way. But not only did it change how I see the world, but it also changed, more importantly, how I saw my own country and my own place in that world, as well as giving me that experience of being the other in an environment that was perhaps uncomfortable, and allowing me to kind of understand that experience of other people as well, because I was then the other in a foreign place. I was the one who was kind of low-skilled because of my own language at the time, and having to cope with that, and you know, a bit of a survivor. You know, not quite, you know, life and death survival, but that, you know, it provided me an opportunity to grow and experience and push myself in new ways along with it. So it's a very complicated, I think, set of goals that international experience provides, that I think I certainly value, and I think it's the kind of thing that I would like, you know, institutions like Dartmouth to be able to offer to their students, is that kind of experience to help them grow and see their place in the world.
Thank you. That was beautifully put. Anybody else want to add to that?
Well, I was thinking, as far as the liberal arts education, to internationalize the experience in the earlier years. I'm not sure exactly what the terminology is, but the core curriculum, or in the first couple years, students have to take distributive requirements. As a parent of a Dartmouth student, I'm really finding that And talking with my daughter, she has a hard time really being able to fit in courses or programs or terms that are international. I think it's harder in the STEM field, and it's hard. And she actually had this idea with the distributive requirements, if that could, if there could be a way to get that integrated. I think prerequisites for off-campus programs or certain things are inhibit students who aren't actually moving forward in a specific major that is part of that.
That's a really important point, and in fact, the curriculum committee, review committee, has talked about making an international experience part of the requirements. And the two obstacles to that have been, one, students who are engaged in a curriculum that doesn't permit them to take time off, away from campus. And the other is, how do we define it? Because many of those students, the students such as your daughter, can't fit in a course, but can fit in a service trip or an opportunity of that type, or an internship, or a research project that takes them somewhere, or get funding to go somewhere to find out, get material for a project. So those things are interconnected. Yeah.
I think they can do that. There's so many competing priorities.
Right.
And instead, I mean, I think it's out of the norm, possibly, to make it the internationalization part. It's not an easy thing to fit in.
Yeah. I want to interrupt to introduce Lindsay.
Sorry, everybody.
Welcome back, or you can see what we're talking about. Your question actually helps us segue in many directions, but one that we could take now is to say, what role do international students play? Because it strikes you, if you think about it, that we send our students off to be international students somewhere else, and we have international students who come to Dartmouth, but we haven't coordinated those two activities or those two groups. So I'd be interested in knowing, I've been talking with Steve Silver about this too, interested in knowing what you think of the international opportunities on campus, international students, international activities, the kinds of activities that students can engage in, whether or not they have a term free or the ability to do a research project of that type.
The only thing I would add to that is this is one of the aspects of internationalization where I think you see a pretty significant difference between the professional schools and the undergraduates, just in terms of pure percentages. Not surprisingly, we see a fairly high percentage of international students in most of our PhD programs, in Thayer, and increasingly in Tuck, with the lowest being at arts and sciences. So this is one where I think, as we think about it, we want to be specific about which portion of the student body we have in mind.
I've got my microphone, Lynn. So I'm going back, I think, to the previous discussion, but I think it segues into this, and that is, I'm worried about what happens to the notion of language when we get too utilitarian in these things. The reason you learn a language, I think, within a liberal arts context is to experience living inside of a different symbolic system from your first language. And I know that Anthony's heart is in the right place, but when he says, because I'm in the German department, when you talk about business German, I think, wait a minute, we don't even teach business at Dartmouth. And then we want to degrade the German language into the way it's done other places, how to write a business letter, which is something students have never done, and usually the way it's taught is found to be comical by Germans. But much more important, if you want to be intersecting with the German economic life, it turns out to be much more important to know opera than it does to know how to sign a business letter, because within the German cultural system, high culture plays an extremely important role. So that if you want to use your skills in a practical way, it's not as direct as people who are designing these things from the top down think. And I think what I always am astonished by is that on Dartmouth's campus, for example, international students tend to feel they have more in common with each other than with the American Dartmouth students, that someone from Norway and someone from China feel their cultures are closer because they have had this experience of that Anthony so eloquently described. And that's what we want our students to be doing. And that could certainly be enhanced by having them interact with international students.
It sounds as if that might mean that having returning off-campus program study students engage in some kind of projects with international students might be the best way to go forward.
And that already works better than the other way.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. Well, we talk a lot about language, but we also talk about intercultural communication, which is a little bit larger than language alone, and that is also kind of what you're talking about there.
Yeah.
That translation can't be done by a machine. Yeah.
But I would say that, yes, it's larger than language, but it's also smaller than language when it doesn't include language.
Definitely.
And that is to go to another country without knowing the language and without at least trying to have the experience of using that language is a very impoverished experience, I think.
Yeah, well, this is a good time also to bring up something that I would really like some input about, which is what should Dartmouth's language requirement be? Should we have a language requirement? And if so, what should it be? A lot of schools have a lot more language requirement than we do, up to 2 years, whereas we have 3 terms or a third term. And some schools have 0 language requirement. So what are your thoughts on requiring students to have that experience with a foreign language? I think Anthony also gave a good answer to that, and I'm keeping his remarks in mind, but there's more to say, I'm sure. No?
Well, just to fill the silence, I don't think any of our distributed requirements are meant to have as its goal mastery, and it may be unrealistic to put that burden on the language requirements. I think the purpose of all our distributive requirements are to push people into trying new things and hopefully following up on them after they've found something interesting there. And so I think it may well be unrealistic to have a language requirement, at least in our context, that aims at everyone having mastery of a language. I wish it could be done.
Did I say that?
No.
No, I didn't. No, that would be ideal, but it's not going to
I'm not arguing with you.
No, I know. I've been studying French all my life, and I wouldn't.
Yeah, it's an
I've still got a
ongoing
lot to
thing.
learn.
You never finish learning a language.
You never finish learning a language, right. And pushing students to explore a lot of things they might not explore otherwise is also bigger than language. It's kind of the definition of the liberal arts, too, to open up new doors and to find out about things you might need later without even knowing yet what you need them for.
Maybe while people are thinking about this question a little bit more, I would point out, at least right now, the way we think about the language requirement at Dartmouth, I think is essentially a competency-based understanding. So granted, there's going to be a lot of difference between Chinese 3 and German 3 and French 3, but we actually define the requirement at a level of competency. So one question I might throw out there is that the right way to think about it? One could imagine other schools say, well, it doesn't matter how competent you are in any language, including your own, you're going to do 2 years of a foreign language. That would be, I'm not throwing that out as our a potential replacement. But what do you think about that? Given Bruce's comments about the inherent value of being inside another system, would it be better to think about the language requirement at Dartmouth in terms of number of classes instead of degree of facility? Be interesting to get people's reactions to that.
For example, in the Curricular Review Committee, we talked a lot about trying to get away from a box-checking exercise of requirements and more toward the idea of an experience, the experience of a college education that brings together a lot of different courses, topics, skills, competencies, and so on. And that would be another way of looking at this, is think of language as something that you experience, and keeping Anthony's points in mind, through which you experience other things. And Bruce, you suggested that too, so that we would see chemistry through the lens of a language that we would be studying, something like that, so that it's part of a holistic experience rather than something, a hoop to jump through and then move on. But I'm sure there are other ways of conceiving of that.
I was just thinking about there's quite a few of our students that test out of the language requirement, right? When they enter. When they enter Dartmouth, they test out of having to take languages. I mean, is that a large percentage of our students?
No.
And how does that fit into your question about requirement to take languages? I mean,
Well, it fits in, and that's exactly our approach, right? So if you've had a prior experience with a language which meets, roughly speaking, the equivalent of what you could get through a 3-level course at Dartmouth, you're done. And there's some benefits to thinking of it that way for some students, but it is a competency-based approach, and it's one of the things that I think there's dialogue on campus. Is that actually why we're pushing students to study language, to have some degree of aptitude in some second language? Or is there a different purpose for it? And we have to be able to answer that question to know how best to design a language requirement or get rid of it. But you know much better than I would in terms of percentage of students.
Well, somewhere between 30 and 40 students a year.
40 students.
Place out, yes.
That's all.
I was a little surprised to find that out too. And then there are language waivers, which are different. But if we were to move to some other model, that might be a different number. We might ask students who'd already reached the level of proficiency that we ask for to take a course, because that would be part of an experience, of a college experience. Lynn.
So this is just a quick response. I don't know if it's an either or. So one of the things that I think about is imagining and supporting the competency-based approach with an experiential approach, meaning that could we imagine an activity and engagement, whether that happens here on campus or it happens in another community and cultural context that makes sense, like an FSP or an internship where there's another language that is being spoken and there's an immersion. So that we would say that perhaps in the liberal arts tradition, it's important for students to have an experience where they are engaged in an activity of exchange of thought, idea, a topic, contextualized through using another language. And so that you could have one sort of unit apply to that, however that gets imagined, but then you also have the competency-based, so that for those students that test out, back to your point, there would be an activity.
Yeah, I ran some focus groups about language study and language requirement, and a lot of people would have liked a system where students would have an opportunity to use the language for something else, like write their honors thesis in the language or something like that. And there again, we ran aground on practical considerations, like who would read it and evaluate it. But still, one could imagine getting some kind of credit or some kind of piece of a requirement where you use it for something, on campus or off campus, research projects, service projects, whatever.
Hi, so I was a French major. I graduated in June, and also a history major. So thinking about maybe capturing this experiential dimension into the just sort of checking boxes and getting competency at the 3 level. I do think that there is an opportunity to maybe have more of a culminating experience type of thing guaranteed for the language requirement. So yes, you're reaching the 3 level in French or Spanish or whatever based off of what you've done in high school already, but then there is this other expectation that you have this either a presentation or some sort of independent research or some sort of international experience in addition to that. And I'm thinking of my own experience on the Paris FSP. There's this really interesting culminating experience in the culture course we took, wherein you have to survey a bunch of Parisians basically about a topic that you are interested in. So there was someone on our program who looked at dance in particular, or someone else who looked at contentious political issues. And so that kind of captured both the linguistic element, but also a cultural competency element. And so if we're looking at something that's a little less curricular and less checking off boxes, I think we could maybe think about guaranteeing an experience, sort of like what you were saying, but framing it as a culminating experience, sort of akin to what majors have.
That's a really interesting idea. Culminating for the language.
Yeah, so something that uses the language, but also, incorporates the international emphasis.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to come back to probably the first question, which won't be a surprise to Lynn. But I think it's, having some clarity in terms of what our goals as an institution for the qualities that we'd like students to graduate with, broadly defined, and then how does an international experience really help support that? And then look at, things like, second language acquisition or intercultural communication skills and so forth. And how is it? How do we establish activities or structure a curriculum and co-curricular activities to support those? And really, it's kind of the reverse engineering approach in terms, instead of focusing maybe so much on the programs or inputs up front.
Yeah, I can think of a number of ways we might formulate that. We tend to talk about intercultural communication as a goal in itself, which it can be. We can say that we want students to acquire an ability to interact cross-culturally, to be able to communicate in complex situations, to learn about the world and its complexity and its diversity. So learn about. We could configure it in terms of being able to use the knowledge. Some of you have suggested that, to use the knowledge for writing a paper, having a culminating experience in the language, interacting with other people on campus who speak that language, writing a paper in that language, and so on. And then there's a third area that has come up increasingly recently, is to do something to the world with it, to save the world, change the world, fix problems. That's the part I have a little more trouble imagining as where the interface is there with the education. What are we asking students to do when we're asking them to solve a problem rather than, or in addition to understanding the problem? So I'd welcome your insights on those and perhaps other ways of formulating this question.
So I like this discussion about kind of what is the institutional goal that we're trying to define here, because this conversation, or lots of elements about this conversation, are things I'm often conflicted by whenever this type of discussion comes up, because in many ways the language requirement I had as an undergraduate was the pathway to that international experience. But especially these days, we have so many bicultural and tricultural students that checking off a box for a language competency or a language requirement doesn't seem to make sense. I mean, they're already coming with possibly, you know, a language themselves and multiple cultures of a background too. But if we're trying to kind of help them contextualize that experience, or to kind of give them an opportunity to think more about even what their own upbringing and background, you know, can contribute as part of their liberal arts education, I think that really does help us open up maybe a path for, you know, defining a goal, and then depending on where someone enters, how that goal, the objectives of the goal are met. If it means that someone would have to take languages in addition to an experience, or bypass the languages because they already have it, but still get, you know, have a culminating experience of something, I think that is probably maybe what we should be looking at more so. But yeah, it's a much, I think the kids who are coming to our institutions are coming from a much richer background than they certainly were when I was an undergraduate.
Much more well-traveled, also widely traveled group.
But also not just traveled, sorry. I was just going to add, because you mentioned the traveling, not just traveling that way, but again, with the way of the internet and the way that that opens up niche communities, there's a lot of people, younger people I know these days, who have found affinity groups online where they are diving into aspects of foreign culture in ways that just weren't possible with or without the travel. And sometimes it incentivizes the travel in order to engage more with that. I mean, let's use the opera experience. I mean, if you've got, you know, a high school student who has found a love of opera, they can find that community online and then really kind of lead them to some other experience on their, you know, where they end up in Vienna or Austria or Germany or whatever. And so that travel, I mean, it does play, I think, a key piece of actually getting them out of their own environment. But again, the pathways to that are also just so much richer.
Yeah, that's really important. In fact, I neglected to mention an additional reason that the Curricular Review Committee kind of moved away from requiring an international experience was that it's almost inevitable to have an international experience, and students seek it out anyway, and we don't necessarily need to require something that everybody's already doing. So there's that element. I overstated it a bit, but that's the idea.
I'd like to ask another question that's not there. It's and it's kind of a play off the third one, but how might the campus itself become more internationalized to support visitors or the activities that the college engages in?
Good question.
And I'll just mention, I saw a presentation once about the University of Helsinki won an award through a professional organization about their efforts on what they called embedded internationalization, and it really dealt with having you know, an understanding of connecting with the world permeate throughout every department in the institution in support of, you know, the broad set of activities, visitors, and so forth.
I can't tell for sure. How many students are here? Not very many. We haven't, if you would like to get into the conversation, please do. I don't want to put you on the spot, but please, we would like to hear from students also.
I guess I am a student in a different sense. Just to back up, it applies to this topic right now, but I think it also underlies a lot of what we're talking about. Is there's an important question too of understanding your own self. You know, like you can take a lot of work to internationalize a community, but until you have a sense of your own, an awareness of yourself as an international being, you know, like there's a lot of critique that Americans in particular who haven't traveled abroad don't see themselves as part of an international community. They don't realize, you know, like the country is international in and of itself, right? Like we're part of a system of governance around the world that partakes in these relationships. So there's certain awareness raising that's critical. And that kind of competency isn't directly international, but it seems foundational, right? So like an exploration of your own power and privilege to contextualize yourself in a broader arena can be applied then to international experiences, to cross-cultural experiences with your roommate, to all kinds of things. So some competencies, there are some bedrock competencies that could aid that don't necessarily mean bringing dozens more international students or really overtly internationalizing the campus, but sort of prime students, I think, to then take advantage of the opportunities in a more meaningful way that do already exist.
Can you give some examples or say a little more about that?
Yeah, just a lot of so I'm at the Tucker Foundation. My name's Adam Knowlton Young, and I oversee our short-term service trips, alternative spring break trips, and the trip that goes to Nicaragua, as well as a first-year leadership program. And one of the foundational things that we work on in our programs is just that awareness, is this self-awareness, particularly in issues of power and privilege, because our trips tend to go to developing world countries where there's an inherent identity issue with being a Dartmouth student going to help folks in rural Nicaragua. And so without an understanding of yourself in that context, you don't, get as much out of it, and you can actually do damage while you're there through your own ignorance. So we sort of try and cultivate that self-awareness. And that's just one example. But I think, again, that awareness I've seen in reflection papers then translates into people's on-campus experiences, say around the freedom budget, for example, of just diversity issues on campus and so forth, that once you're a self-aware being in an intercultural context, then there's a natural outflow and ability to make the connections to other examples in your life. So it serves as an integrating force and contextualizing and integrating disparate points of experience, I think, if that explains a little bit more.
Thanks for coming. Anybody have anything else they would like to say? This is your chance. Okay.
Thank you, Lynn and Lindsay, for being with us. I'd just like to remind folks that if you come up with other ideas, think of other things that you'd like to suggest, you can always obviously email Lynn or Lindsay, but you're welcome to also contact the President's office. For folks who couldn't make it here today and you would like to participate, or if you know of others who couldn't make it here at lunchtime, please have them join us this evening at 6:30. We're in the Fahey ground floor lounge. And as always, I welcome your comments and thoughts. We do hope to bring the series back beginning in the fall, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on what we could tackle then, other ways to make this a more productive, engaging discussion, and to get more folks in the room, more voices at the table. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. That's great. It's actually kind of interesting where people went with stuff. So. Yeah.
Just keep it as indiscreet as possible. Here.
Oh, okay. That's good for me.
Yeah, I sent also the left. This is for
So from 3:30 to